Hello from an eco farm in the Peruvian Andes. Do you plan on doing a motorcycle adventure ride across South America? Do you want to do that on a tight budget, but you still want something that's dependable and can do some off-roading? Maybe even with lower seat heights? Well, in that case, the Suzuki GN125F might just be the right motorcycle for you. Full disclosure, this is not a sponsored video. This motorbike belongs to my partner. She bought it a couple months ago in Medellin, Colombia to join me on my own motorbike trip around the world on the Latin American leg. So far we've done about 3,000 kilometers on this, and we've covered some highways, dirt tracks, gravel and some gnarlier trails on it too, and some altitude change all the way from sea level up to a brisky altitude of 3,600 meters. The GN125 is pretty close in specifications and design to a farm bike. If you watched Fortnite's TW200 video, you will understand why I'm a big fan of those. And they're often used as such, and this role demands something that is tough, affordable, good on trails and easy to get on and off on a frequent basis. Something that also translates well into a bike that you want to go out on and explore on. People call the KLR 650 and TW200 living fossils, but this predates both of them, and unlike the KLR 650, it has barely changed since its original inception going back to 1982. Just to illustrate how long ago that was, Shenzhen still looked like this, the Cold War was in full swing, and Donkey Kong in the arcades was the hottest thing in video games. This year is the 2025 model, the first one which came out with ABS. I'm not sure when they came out with electronic gauges. To me, it's got a similar appearance to the TU50X, which has its own fan base. Fortnite reckons that it's one of the most underappreciated bikes out there. And I'll freely admit, I have a bit of a soft spot for it too. First impressions, at about 8,000 Colombian pesos, which translates to about $2,000 US out of the showroom with taxes. It's not the cheapest 125cc bike you can buy. That's why you see so many Chinese cheap bikes floating around in all of Latin America. But you do get a lot of motorcycle for it, and it's nicely built really. So you've got these nice fenders with metal and chrome. Metal tank, lots of metal components, even the plastic parts, they're quite nicely made with a nice metallic paint on the tank and on these panels. And those positive impressions continue with the gauge cluster. So you've got analog gauges that are run digitally, no spinny cables. You even have a rev counter, a fuel gauge, ABS indicator. Yes, it's an ABS bike. A trip computer, which I really appreciate because it makes it easier to monitor your fuel economy. And a gear indicator, which is absolutely lovely. The positive impressions continue with all of the controls. Everything feels nice and smooth. The brakes, all of the switches are high quality. Rear brake, the gear shifter feels nice and smooth. You can pull the clutch with your pinky, it's that light. Nice thing as well is you've got this flasher here for the high beam. The only complaint I might have is a lack of hazard lights, and this lovely switch is integrated into the switch gear, which makes it a bit more difficult to upgrade, unlike what I have done on my Honda Wave, where I have changed the flasher unit and the switch. The engine is just like its ancestors, a 125cc air-cooled one-lunger with 2 valves total. Because we're traveling up in the Andes and we still want to go up to Bolivia and to Chile, where you go well over 4,000 meters at some point, we really wanted to have EFI. But Latin America is really backwards with this, unlike Thailand, where everything over 100cc has got EFI. Up here, it's all carburettors. Even on some Chinese bikes up to 300cc, they're still carburetted. So this runs a Mikuni unit that says Japan on it. And I have to say, this carburetor impressed me because it has been the least fussy I have ever had on any carbureted engine. Just to demonstrate here, this is no cut. This engine is ice cold. If I now sit up here, I'm gonna have to put the camera between myself. There we go. Rotate the handlebars, turn this on, give it a bit of choke, clutch. And we are currently at 2,700 meters altitude. It runs remarkably well. In terms of power delivery, it's smooth. It's very different to the horizontal 125cc engines from Honda, like the Monkey, C125, CT125 or my Wave, where they feel a bit like a lazy V8, where they chug away from low RPMs and they make all the power in the mid-range and nothing's going on high up. Plus you've got a rev limiter. These here, they love to rev. They pull okay From low down, they do stall quite easy when you're not giving it enough revs. But once you go past 5, 6, 7,000 RPM, it feels like VTEC kicks in. They just keep going, which makes me just worried a little bit if you are giving it the beans that you might over rev them, because I don't know if they have a rev limiter or not. It pulls harder than an air-cooled 2-valve bike has any right to. It just walks away from me on my Wave, and my Wave was doing that to the Avetta, which is got a 127cc engine. In terms of noise levels, your neighbors will appreciate this bike because it is really, really quiet. It's actually running right now. It would be nice if it had a slightly punchier exhaust note, but I prefer having that than having something really loud. I'll just be quiet and let you hear it for yourselves. It would be nice if it had a punchier noise, but when you're doing hours in the seat, I prefer to have something a bit more subdued, especially compared to something like the CB125E, where the engine sounded like having an angle grinder between your legs. This actually sounds way more refined. Please skip ahead if I'm boring you with this Mikuni Carburettor, because that thing has impressed me. I've had a lot of bad experiences with carbs, which is why I'm skeptical of them. Be it a Dream 100, Dream 125, Wave 125S, Wave 125X, a Cityfly 125, 2 CB125Es, and the Avetta. All of them had their own little foibles where they would have a much worse flat spot when cold. Bikes in Thailand, they would sputter and complain at altitudes of 1600 to 2000 meters. This year, we're at 2700, which is why I'm a bit out of breath sometimes. No problems. We've been up to 3600, no problem. Apparently these are tuned in Medellin, which lies at 1500 meters. Maybe that explains why they handle the altitude so well. A thing that I also have had with carburetors was that they needed a cleanup. This has got a huge fuel filter, which I think is a good preventative measure. One place where this bike still disappoints is at the pump every time you fill up, because this takes about 2.7 liters to 100 compared to the 2 to 2.1 that my Wave needs for the same distance, while carrying me, who is heavier and more luggage too. At least Suzuki do give you a 10.3 liter fuel tank, which would give you a range of 300 kilometers or more compared to the 5.4 liter tank on my Wave, which gives me about 250 or less kilometers depending on how much my bike drinks. The power goes through a 5-speed gearbox, which is geared low. It matches the engine's characteristics, and first gear is super low. You can just walk this bike really easily without having to pull the clutch. If you're on a proper flat surface, you are actually walking faster than this thing when it idles. And that makes it like really useful for farmers, because they have to herd animals and they don't always have to run. But it's also useful in our case on some more challenging or technical terrain where you don't always have the option of just powering through. You can just take it easy and even waddle through some scenarios without having to torture the clutch, because I have seen some guys who have taken adventure bikes up on some difficult roads and they've burned their clutches out. On this year, no need. Another place where this bike has just absolutely surprised me are these super nice shock absorbers. They're just so smooth. They absolutely shine on uneven surfaces like corrugations. Seating position, if you're a normal size or a bit taller, I'm 1.80 m or 5'10", which is the exact average for a man, is good. I've got a relatively low foot peg, so my legs are not too cramped, unlike on many sports bikes, scooters or some dirt bikes. And if you add the crash bars, you can relax a bit more on the highway. The basic way to describe these brakes is adequate. A mechanically driven drum brake in the rear, which is perfectly fine on a 125cc bike. While they do have less feedback than discs, rear brakes are a bit of a blunt tool since you don't have that much feel in your feet anyway. They do brake much harder than most rear discs that I've tried in the past. They also last much longer usually too. Just be mindful on long descents that drums suffer more from brake fade. Although I do wonder how much of an issue that really is, since they're integrated into the cast wheel, which should act as a heatsink. On the front, we've got a really large disc for this bike's size, which is great out here in those mountains as that extra surface area is better at shedding heat. It's paired with a twin piston caliper that hasn't got any name labeled on it. Honda usually have got a Nissan stamped on them. If you do get the ABS variant, similar to Honda's 125cc bikes, it only actuates on the front. Again, small bike, that's perfectly fine here. It's actually preferable if you do go on dirt, because sometimes you actually want to lock up the rear wheel. However, unlike Honda, Suzuki actually spent a bit extra money on these because they've got sensors in the front and in the rear wheel too. I actually tested it on some grass and it works remarkably well. But it's not 100% foolproof. It does lock up in brief bursts in the front. That's great on gravel because it can build up small mounds, acting as a wedge, helping with stopping. The downside is that it can cause the front wheel to wash out, causing a low side.
I'm doing like 40, so that's not too bad on grass. And foot brake. Clutch. There we go.
As comes with the territory of a manual Gearbox 125, it's light at the low center of gravity, low seat, and you've got a bike that you don't worry about dropping or getting stuck. You just pick it up. Something that is also low, but in a bad way, is the air intake. It only sits at about knee high, so just be careful if you do go through deeper water, unless you want to modify the air intake. But at least in this part of the world, we haven't encountered anything that is more than ankles deep. If you do encounter something deeper without prior preparation, hopefully you've got a friend with you, because then you can just carry the bike through that river. And if you do mess it up entirely, at least it's quite easy to get the spark plug out.
Ever since the series came out in the 1980s, they come with cast wheels, which some adventure bikers scoff at because they think they'll explode if you look at a pothole. Spokes don't have magic properties. These bikes have got physics on their side by means of tall tires. The front is a 18 by 2.75 inch compared with the CT125, which has got 17 by 2.25 inches, and the rear a 16 by 3.5 inches. That gives you the same outer diameter as the CT's 17 by 2.5 inch, however with much taller sidewalls, and that gives you a couple advantages. Number one is it increases the distance between the rim and your tire, so if you hit a pothole, there's a lot more space before you impact. The next one as well is for off-roading. It lets you play with lower tire pressures without increasing the risk of damage. So if you now drop your tire pressures, there's less deformation because you've got more space on rubber to dissipate heat, and it's less deformation per distance that you've got, and that gives you a couple advantages. The first one is you can increase your flotation on boggy surfaces because your footprint increases. It becomes mostly longer. The next one as well is grip, because your tire can now grip around surfaces a bit easier than if it was as hard as if it was made out of steel. And the last one is suspension, because you get a little bit more bump, which is really beneficial on things like corrugations. Other advantages now of these spoked rims is natively these can run tubeless tires, and Suzuki did fit these bikes with tubeless tires. However, they also fitted them with tubes on the inside. Welcome to Latin America, I guess. And the next advantage is that these do not ever need any maintenance unless you break them. There's no spokes to tighten up or to get loose. They also run nice and true. Lastly, on the tires, the back, fantastic job Suzuki. This is a lovely Kenda tire name brand, and it's got a good pattern. That's a happy mix between road and off-road. The front, what the hell? This has got like some weird pattern out of the 1950s, which is just straight lines, which would not grip really well if you try to stop on the dirt. So we replaced it with this Michelin City Extra. That is the most aggressive road tire that we found from a name brand manufacturer. You can find lots of no-name Chinese tires in Colombia and South America. I just don't know if I can trust them. With Michelin, because we spend most of our time on the road, these have a reputation for being pretty good in wet surfaces, and luckily we never had to push it to its limit. They've been working okay on sealed and unsealed surfaces. It would be nice if this was a bit more aggressive still, but it's been fine. It's been good. Add to that the low seat height, low center of gravity and low gearing, and you've got a motorcycle that is incredibly easy to ride on technical or difficult terrain. If you're not competent, you can just waddle through some of the more difficult stuff. If you are, that stable layout of the frame and low center of gravity make for a super competent platform. Yes, it's not a dirt bike, but you can ride it quite briskly on some uneven surfaces and it will just behave. Mods, and no adventure bike is ever ready out of the showroom, and this is quite an easy bike to work on, including the electrics. It runs a pretty beefy stator that's running 3-phase into a DC only system, so there's no shenanigans going on with half wave positive ground AC coming into the headlight. The headlight is actually quite decent, but at nighttime it's still nice to have a little bit of extra lighting. Unfortunately, this bike does not have any accessory plugs, but because you've got so much space in this housing and because everything is in there, you can work off that quite easily. So one of the first things we did was we added spotlights. They are just mounted with these brackets that mechanic had lying around in their shop, wired them straight into the plug of this bulb. You don't want to hack into the main harness, because if you mess it up, it's a bit less damage that you've done. And these lights actually impressed me. They're really, really bright. They've got a nice pattern as well. You can adjust them so that you can keep them on without blinding everyone. They've got 3 modes, which I usually didn't like, but they're quite easy to switch. By default, they always switch into yellow fog lights. If you want to switch them, no need to mess with lenses or anything, just turn them off and on again, and you've got white. And if you want to get attention, you can put them into party mode. Because road signage sucks everywhere nowadays and phones make good navigation devices, so the first thing as well is a phone holder. This is one of the better ones I managed to find in Medellin. We might replace it with a RAM quick grip, which is a bit easier to read. You just have to cover it in the rain. At least this thing here is waterproof. To keep that phone charged, we have a USB charger on here. It is in this plastic bag because it's difficult to find a good place where it is out of the elements. One important thing if you wire in a phone charger, any charger, is try to not put it straight into the battery. Don't wire any accessories straight into the battery, because if you forget to turn them off, you walk away, come back again, and your bike is dead. So we have wired it in, or I have wired it in, into this lower bulb at the bottom, because that comes on with ignition and its state doesn't change if you turn it on and off, and it's a beefy enough wire that you can run a small charger. For any bigger accessories, it might make sense to get a relay inside of here or mount it somewhere on the bike to give you a little bit more amperage if you want to get something like heated grips. A bit of a word of warning: if you do get these kind of accessories installed by mechanics in Latin America, just beware, these guys are flipping butchers. The first guy who wired in the lights and charger completely messed it up. He wired in the charger into some circuit that I think drives the dashboard, because that partially stayed live, creating a parasitic drain on the battery. If this was a bike that we kept for a bit longer, and especially if you're riding solo, something I would recommend as well, but you have to order it online because it's difficult to find, is maybe a 12-volt outlet, so you can power things like a compressor and stuff like that of the bike as well. To protect the bike in a tip over, like the indicator, brakes, mirror and stuff, we've got these little crash bars. They're of that kind of slider design. I'm not a big fan of them, because if you fall over on a soft surface while in motion, they can dig in and they can rotate or they can twist, adding a bit of twisting motion onto the frame. Luckily, that frame is round up here, so they should only rotate around, and this here is pretty weak on here as well. They do move around quite a bit. They're nowhere near as strong as something like the GV bars that I had on my 500X, but unfortunately this is the strongest you can get for this bike in Latin America. And to prevent some of these tip overs, I've also added this foot extender or foot widener, because motorbike manufacturers think we always park on concrete. This one is just a cheap screw-on unit. I did have to modify it a little bit because it does interface with the center stand, so I just have to file back a little bit at the bottom. Getting towards luggage, let's start with the rack that's holding these cheap pannier bags. And I'm really appreciative that you can just buy off-the-shelf bags, because explaining to somebody in a developing country how to make a rack is extremely difficult. My experience doing it with the Avetta in Malaysia was not pleasant. So this is from Colombia, from a brand named French. It even has a feature that I usually appreciate a lot, and that is shelves which stop your bags from sagging down too low. However, that exhaust is so low and the shelves are by default sitting so high up, your bags would be hovering really high up. So I just unbolted them, rotated them around and fitted them this way, and made sure that these bags are secured well enough that they will never touch the exhaust. And those bags are just kind of a thing where I'm a little bit frustrated with the availability of good quality stuff here in Latin America. They're these kind of Chinese units, which they seem like a good idea. They've got these carry handles and stuff, but they're not proper waterproof. You have to put covers on them. Yes, they're cheap. The zippers, they're cheap, so they kind of stay open. You always worry that you're going to break them. And they've got this weird buckle system at the bottom, which is really difficult to get to. And these strange small bags on the outside, which make the bike really wide when you're traveling through city traffic. So if you come here, maybe bring something like Nelson Rig panniers, which are actually proper waterproof and have got way more volume inside. If I was taking this bike out solo into remote areas, I would also add a tool tube, kind of like what I've done on my Honda Wave, by just having a PVC tube in parallel with the exhaust.
Following Austin Vince's formula, besides soft bags that protect your legs in a tip over, we do have a lockable top box, which is a DR1 brand, but they're all kind of made in a similar fashion in most of Colombia and Latin America. They're made out of plastic, which means they do flex a little bit, but it's strong enough that it doesn't crack or kind of give you any issues. I don't know what kind of plastic it is. They're also lined on the inside nicely, so your stuff doesn't get all scratched up and banged up like it does in my Gearbox, which is just raw aluminium on the inside. It's also a lot lighter. My Gearbox weighs over 5 kilograms. This, I guess, maybe half, even though it's much bigger. It's just not as easy to take on and off. You have to undo some screws at the bottom, so this will just stay on here. Another thing I like with it as well is that latching mechanism, because it closes shut properly without having to lock it. So I can lock it or I cannot, and I can still drive it without having it fly open on me. Just like my GV as well, it's got nice tie down points at the top. They're not as solid or as strong, so this is just some kind of plastic with these aluminium rails on the top, which lets you tie down some stuff like a sleeping bag or something other that is light. And those also let you tie down a little bit of luggage in front of it on the passenger seat in the back. Elaine usually keeps a backpack in here, and because the whole box sits so low on this low-lying rack, it doesn't upset your center of gravity or the balance on the bike too much, even if you do load it up. Because the panniers are so small and because there's no additional storage like on a step-through bike, we added a tank bag. This is from Fox. I don't know if it's a genuine Fox or if it's a Chinese clone. I don't know. It's made quite cheap as well with these R&R zippers. I would expect something a bit more high quality like YKK. Bizarre as usual, I don't know why, where it's got these flaps on here, but you're meant to tie it down through the front. It's just really strange, especially with these buckles that are rubbing on your tank, which is why I've added this piece of tape to protect the tank. I've also sewn on these straps that I luckily had the foresight to bring with me when I replaced my old Nelson rig panniers, and I had these sewn on here professionally after I came up with the design, so they now sits nice and strong on the top. Even though the seat is actually not too bad, Elaine was complaining about it giving her a sore butt after some prolonged rides. So we deployed this here. Elaine calls it her booty bagel. It's a trick that Colombians told us about, which is the inner tube of a Bajaj tuk-tuk or a Piaggio Ape that I just tie down on. And ever since she's been using it, she hasn't been complaining about a sore butt anymore. I've actually been liking it too, and I might add one to my Honda Wave as well.
One minor annoyance is the fender. As pretty as it is, it's too short. It's why it sprays all over the back. I'm going to solve it by turning this into part Honda. This is a CT125 mud flap. I have cut a hole in the center. I'm going to use this rubber nub. Going to go through here, tie it up with a bit of rope so it doesn't slide down, and that should solve our issue. There we go, tied up. So now that shouldn't come off. Looks almost like factory.
We've been happy with the bike as it is for now, but as we're heading down towards Tierra del Fuego, we would like to maybe make it a bit more cold weather friendly. That means adding a windscreen just to keep the cold wind off us, maybe some bark busters and heated grips that I would wire in via a relay that gets triggered off that little running light in the front. Maintenance is also a breeze on this bike because everything is easy to access, nothing is hidden from you. As Jay Leno says, he likes the motorbike you can see through. Everything is here. It even has a spyglass to check your oil level. You don't have to muck around with dipsticks like with this nice metal plug. It has a oil filter. Thank you so much. This will really add on to the reliability of this bike. The sump plug is easy enough to access. You don't even need a skid plate or anything like that. If you do drown it in a water crossing, here's your spark plug, and no need to remove any fairings or disassemble half a damn motorcycle. Even if you ever have to do the valve adjustments, it's just here. You just might have to take off this little hose and that's it. I will have to at some point probably open up the carburetor if we head into 4,000 meters or higher to play with jets. We did buy a couple from Suzuki when we got this motorcycle, but so far, touch wood, we never had to work on that. In terms of dependability and reliability, this bike has been solid. Nothing moves, nothing needed any adjustment. It just works. Completely different to the Avetta, which is again why I don't like those Chinese bikes. We had those issues with these electrics, but those were done by those mechanics locally here. Even the chain and the consumables are pretty good. So this is the original chain, and after 3,000 kilometers, yes, it's stretched a little bit, but it's nothing like DID standard duty chains that Honda like to use on their horizontal 125cc bikes. A pain in the neck that we've been running into with this bike have been our efforts in trying to keep the warranty. Suzuki Colombia require you to have the bike serviced by all authorized Suzuki dealerships. The problem that you run into are to a good extent the dealerships themselves, or rather the lack of them, because all too commonly businesses just don't answer their phone. We've spent hours and hundreds of kilometers detouring just to find one of those few dealerships, only to then find that they don't have any time for the day, or that they're shut because they're either on lunch break or because it's one of those very many public holidays, since Latin America seems to be a champion in those. Something that hasn't been a problem for us are parts. Except for an oil filter, we just didn't need any, and that oil filter we managed to get from Bajaj, a genuine one, since some of their bikes use the same unit. For more difficult items, given their long production run and how many of these have been sold all over the world, I don't expect you run into any problems either. If you can't get a genuine part, then have a look at Shinrei and some other Chinese manufacturers, although in my experience of Chinese parts, I don't expect them to last as long as genuine Suzuki. What kills these bikes? Well, I honestly don't have any reports of them breaking. They're not as common as some of the Hondas, but I imagine that it could die of similar causes because it only has got an 850mm sump that is quite shallow with a oil pickup that I assume is in the front, just like on the Honda, since the filter is here. Here's where some electronics would be really useful besides giving you a better fuel economy. An ECU with a temperature sensor can sense that the engine is running hot, so it could dial back on the ignition timing, causing the engine to run a little bit more rich and not as powerful, but it produces less heat and it protects itself. Some sensors also would be useful that Honda also refused to add. Two come to mind. One of them is an oil level sensor, that if your oil level is too low, the idiot light could come on the dashboard, and an oil pressure sensor that if your oil level is critically low or you've got some issues, you could know that you really need to stop the engine now to prevent some damage. As you'll have figured from my overall tone in this very long review video, I think this is a cracking little motorcycle, especially if you want to do a big trip around South America on a bike that's truly short rider friendly, dependable, and also off-road capable. If you like this video, why not tell the algorithm by pressing this thumb-shaped button? Have a look in the comments, because people always have got something valuable to say. I appreciate every bit of feedback I can get. And a subscription goes a long way, especially on a small channel like mine. I don't create much content, so you won't get bombarded with notifications. And thank you to everybody who has subscribed so far, because thanks to you, I can now make a little bit of pocket change with this little YouTube adventure. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and until next time, have a great time.